The Other Man Prologue. The interview Jae-hyun had learned a long time ago that the trick to being wanted was to look like you didn't want anything at all. He sat with his knees together and his hands folded in his lap in the receiving room of the Kang household. And he let the silence stretch a beat too long before answering the housekeeper's questions, because eagerness read as hunger, and hunger frightened rich people. Stillness, on the other hand, stillness they mistook for peace, for safety, for harmless. "You've tutored children before?" the housekeeper asked, flipping through a folder that contained exactly as much truth as Jae-hyun had decided to give it. "A little," Jae-hyun said, softly enough that she leaned in to hear him. "I like children, they're honest." It wasn't a lie. Children were the only people he'd never had to perform for, because children didn't care what you provided them, only how you made them feel in the moment, and Jae-hyun was very, very good at that. Down the hall, a small voice was already shrieking about something, a broken crayon, a missing shoe, some catastrophe of 6-year-old proportions. And underneath it, fainter, a woman's voice, flat with exhaustion, saying, "Ha-eun, please, not now. Mommy has a headache." Jae-hyun filed that away too. Mommy has a headache a lot, probably. He got the job by dinner time. Chapter 1. The warmth they were missing the Kang house ran on money and silence, and Jae-hyun understood within his first week that the two were not unrelated. Se-yeon left early and came home late, her heels clicking through the marble entryway like punctuation on a day she never discussed. Tae-hyun worked from a home office with the door shut, emerging for meals with his phone still in his hand, already halfway back into whatever call he'd stepped out of. And in the middle of all that expensive, well-appointed distance was Ha-eun, 6 years old, endlessly loud, endlessly ignored in the specific, well-fed way that rich children are ignored, which is to say, never left alone, never truly seen. Jae-hyun saw her. It cost him nothing. That was the secret nobody in this house understood yet. That attention was the cheapest currency in the world if you actually meant to spend it, and Jae-hyun, who meant nothing else in that house, meant every ounce of it when it came to her. "You drew the sun wrong," he told her on his third day, crouching beside her at the low table in the playroom. "I did not. The sun doesn't have a face. My son does." Ha-eun glared at him with the ferocity of someone who had never once been told no by an adult who wasn't also visibly annoyed by her. "My son is happy because it likes me." Jae-hyun looked at the lopsided yellow circle with its crooked smile for a long moment, and something in his chest did an unfamiliar, inconvenient thing, small and warm and entirely unbudgeted for. "That's a good son," he said, and meant it, and hated a little that he meant it, because meaning things wasn't part of the plan. By the second week, she was sneaking into the kitchen to help him make her afternoon snack, standing on a step stool with her tongue between her teeth as she stirred fruit into yogurt with far more violence than was strictly necessary. By the third week, the head housekeeper, a stern older woman named Miss Beek, who had buried 2 of Se-yeon's predecessor nannies with her eyes alone, started leaving Jae-hyun the good tea instead of the everyday kind, without comment, the way people show approval when they've decided not to say it out loud. By the fourth week, Tae-hyun started coming home for dinner. Jae-hyun noticed it the way he noticed everything sideways, without seeming to notice at all. The CEO of Kang Innovations, a man whose calendar was managed in 15-minute increments by 3 separate assistants, began appearing in the doorway of the playroom around 6 p.m., ostensibly to say goodnight to his daughter, staying 20 minutes longer than that required. "She likes you," Tae-hyun said one evening, watching Ha-eun show Jae-hyun a drawing of what she insisted was a dragon and what was, generously, a potato with teeth. "She's easy to like," Jae-hyun said, not looking up. "She just wants someone to actually look at what she's showing them." Tae-hyun was quiet for a second too long. "That an accusation?" Jae-hyun finally glanced up wide-eyed, the picture of someone who hadn't meant anything by it at all. "No, just an observation." He watched the words land anyway, watched Tae-hyun's jaw tighten slightly. The particular flinch of a man who already knew he was failing at something and hadn't expected to be reminded of it by the 23-year-old tutor. Jae-hyun filed that away too, gently, the way you'd press a flower you already knew you'd need later. He hadn't lied. He never really had to. That was the elegant part of what he did. He simply stood in the exact place where the truth was most flattering to him and let people walk into it on their own. At night alone, he counted the small victories the way other people counted money, because to him they amounted to the same thing. A housekeeper's approval. A child's unguarded love, which he hadn't budgeted for and didn't know what to do with yet, so he simply let it sit, unexamined, in the same drawer where he kept everything else he preferred not to look at directly. A CEO's attention, slow and reluctant, and therefore worth more than if it had come easily. He had grown up in a one-room apartment above a noodle shop, watching his mother work 2 jobs and still come home to a landlord who didn't care that the heat had been broken for a week. And he had decided, very young, that softness was the only tool available to someone with no money and no name. That if the world was only ever going to give things to people it found pleasant to look at, he would simply become the most pleasant thing in any room he walked into, and let everyone else do the arithmetic of what that was worth. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was accounting. He had simply never found a version of honesty that paid as well as the alternative. Chapter 2, Selfish Reasons Tae-hyun didn't fall in love with Ji-yeon. He fell into him the way a tired man falls into a chair because it was there, because it was soft, because nothing in it asked anything of him. It started with small things. A cup of tea left on his desk without being asked, always the temperature he liked, always right when he needed it. A quiet knock at 11 p.m. with a plate of fruit, because you skipped dinner, I noticed, you don't have to eat it if you don't want, delivered in a tone so gentle it made refusing feel like cruelty. Ji-yeon never lingered. He never pushed. He simply kept being there, soft-eyed and undemanding, in a house that had otherwise gone silent around Tae-hyun years ago. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself a lot of things. "You work too hard," Ji-yeon said one night, finding him still at his desk long after Ha-eun was asleep. He set the tea down and didn't leave immediately, which was new. "Somebody has to. Does it have to be you every night?" Ji-yeon tilted his head, and the lamp light did something unfair to his face, softened it, gilded it, made him look like something out of a painting rather than a person standing in an office. "You look tired, Mr. Kang." Nobody in this house called him tired anymore. Se-yeon hadn't asked how he was doing in longer than he could remember. They'd stopped being people who checked on each other sometime around the 3rd miscarriage, back before Ha-eun, when grief had hardened into 2 separate silences living under one roof instead of one shared one. He knew distantly that this wasn't fair to blame on her. He knew a lot of things distantly these days. "I'm fine," he said, which was the lie he told everyone, including himself. "You don't have to be fine around me," Ji-yeon said, so quietly it barely registered as manipulation at all. "I'm just the tutor. I don't need anything from you." "I don't need anything from you." It was, Tae-hyun would think much later, the single most effective sentence anyone had ever said to him, precisely because it wasn't true, and precisely because he had wanted so badly for it to be. He kissed him 3 weeks later, in the hallway outside the playroom, after Ha-eun had fallen asleep on the rug, and Ji-yeon had carried her to bed himself because no one else in the house had noticed she wasn't in her room. Ji-yeon let him. And even, convincingly, kissed him back, soft and startled and a little breathless, exactly the way a person looks when something forbidden and wonderful is happening to them against their will. It was, in fact, exactly the way Ji-yeon had planned it to look. Later, alone in the small guest room he'd been given at the edge of the house, Ji-yeon sat on the edge of the bed and touched his own mouth, thoughtfully, the way you'd check a wound to see if it still hurt. It never did. That was the thing nobody would believe about him if he told them, which he never would. That he could stand in the center of another man's whole unraveling life and feel, personally, almost nothing at all, except, unhelpfully, for the 6-year-old down the hall who'd started leaving her bedroom door cracked open so she could hear him say goodnight. That part he hadn't planned for, that part he didn't know what to do with yet. Chapter 3. Ha-eun Se-yeon noticed the shift the way she noticed everything about her own marriage lately, a little late, and from a distance, like watching weather move in over a city she used to live in. It wasn't any one thing. It was that Tae-hyun came home for dinner now, which should have felt like a victory and instead felt like a held breath. It was that Ha-eun's drawings, taped in a growing gallery along the playroom wall, had started to feature a 4th stick figure alongside the 3 of them. A thin one with straight black hair, always drawn holding Ha-eun's hand. "Who's this?" Se-yeon asked one evening, kneeling by the wall with a wine glass she hadn't touched in an hour. "That's Appa," Ha-eun said, matter of fact, already moving on to the next drawing. Appa, and Ji-yeon, mashed together the way children build their own private language out of the people they love most, without asking permission from anyone, including themselves. Se-yeon looked at the drawing for a long moment, the crooked smiling sun, the 4 figures holding hands in a row, her own stick figure self standing slightly apart from the others. The way a child draws what she's absorbed without knowing she's absorbed it, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. "Ha-eun," she said carefully, "I have a mommy and I have a daddy. I don't have an Appa." Ha-eun looked up at her with the guileless cruelty only children are capable of. I do, though. Se-yeon didn't say anything to that. She finished her wine standing up alone in a playroom decorated with evidence she wasn't yet ready to name. She found Jae-in in the kitchen an hour later, tidying up after Ha-eun's bath with the quiet, unhurried competence of someone who belonged there more than the woman who'd built the house. She calls you Appian, Se-yeon said without preamble. Jae-in turned and his face did something remarkable, surprise, embarrassment, a flush that crept convincingly up his throat. I've told her not to. I'm sorry, Mrs. Kang, I really have tried to correct her. Have you? I know how it must sound. Jae-in's eyes were wide, glassy, the picture of a young man mortified to have caused offense. I never encouraged it. I would never, I'm just her tutor. She's 6. She attaches to people, that's all it is. It was technically all true. Jae-in had technically corrected her, once half-heartedly in a tone that told a 6-year-old exactly how little he meant it. He had never once, in any of his careful, deniable little maneuvers, told a lie that could be proven a lie. That was the whole architecture of him. Plausible, gentle, always one layer removed from anything you could actually hold him accountable for. Se-yeon studied his face for a long moment, the trembling lip, the downcast eyes, and felt, despite everything, the specific helplessness of a woman who could not find a single sentence to be angry at. Just be more careful, she said finally, and hated herself a little for how small it came out. Of course, Jae-in said softly, I only ever want what's best for this family. He watched her leave, and when the door clicked shut behind her, his face did not change at all because there had never been anything on it to begin with. Chapter 4. The brother who knew better, Do-hyun, had never liked his sister's husband, which was a low bar to clear when it came to liking Jae-in even less. He came by the house more often once he heard the rumors, not from Se-yeon, who would never admit to needing anyone's help, but from Miss Beek, who told him over coffee in the kind of clipped, careful language household staff use when they want someone to read between the lines without technically having said anything. There's a young man, she said. The tutor, he's very attentive. Attentive to who? Miss Beek's silence answered for her. Do-hyun showed up the next afternoon with the specific energy of a man who'd already decided how the conversation was going to go. He found Jae-in in the garden with Ha-eun. The two of them crouched over a caterpillar with the kind of shared, ridiculous focus that made his chest do something he chose to ignore. You're the tutor, Do-hyun said, arms crossed, standing over him like he expected Jae-in to flinch. Jae-in looked up unhurried. You must be Se-yeon's brother. Ha-eun talks about you. Does she? Do-hyun crouched too, mostly so he wouldn't have to keep looking down at someone who so clearly wanted to be looked down at, which irritated him more than he could articulate. I'll be straight with you. I don't know what you're doing in this house, but I know what it looks like. What does it look like? Like you've made yourself very necessary very fast. Jae-in's expression didn't waver, soft, patient, a little sad, like he was used to being misunderstood and had made peace with it. I take care of your niece because someone should. I'm sorry if that reads as suspicious to you. I didn't say suspicious. Do-hyun's jaw was tight. I said necessary. Those aren't the same thing, and you know it, because a man who's actually as harmless as he's pretending to be doesn't choose his words that carefully. For a fraction of a second, so brief that later Do-hyun would half convince himself he'd imagined it, something flickered across Jae-in's face that wasn't soft at all. Something assessing. Something that looked disturbingly like interest, the way a card player looks at an opponent who's finally shown a decent hand. Then it was gone, replaced by wide, wounded eyes. I don't know what I've done to make you dislike me so much. That's the problem, Do-hyun thought, standing up too fast, unsettled in a way he didn't have words for yet. You haven't done anything at all. That's exactly the problem. He told himself he was going to keep an eye on this one. He told himself that for 3 more weeks, during which he found excuses to visit more often, to stay for dinner, to walk Jae-in out to his bus stop, to make sure he got home safe. To notice, against every instinct he owned, the particular slant of Jae-in's smile when he thought no one important was watching. He was, in the end, exactly as easy as his brother-in-law had been. He simply took longer to admit it, and told himself a better story about why. He started boxing harder those weeks, as if he could sweat the feeling out of himself before it set. It didn't work. He'd come by the house afterward, showered, hair still damp, telling himself he was only stopping in to see his niece, and end up instead in the kitchen at 10 at night, watching Jae-in rinse a single teacup with a care that seemed excessive for something so small, and think, this is stupid, this is beneath me, I am not going to be the second one. He was the second one anyway. He simply hadn't found out about the first yet. Chapter 5. The best friend who was only trying to help Han Yu-jin had known Se-yeon since their first year of university, which meant he'd known her through 2 failed relationships, 1 difficult pregnancy, and a marriage that had gone quietly. Expensively wrong in a way she never fully said out loud, but he'd learned to read anyway, in the length of her silences on their weekly phone calls. "There's a rumor," she told him one night, 3 glasses of wine into a conversation she'd clearly been avoiding for weeks. "About Tae-hyun and the tutor. The kid who does Ha-eun's homework? He's 23, Yu-jin. He's not a kid." Se-yeon's laugh had no humor in it at all. "I don't even know if it's true. I just know my husband comes home for dinner now and I don't know why, and my daughter has an imaginary second father, and I feel insane for even saying any of this out loud." "You're not insane. Want me to look into it?" He asked it lightly, the way you offer to do a friend a small favor, and told himself for weeks afterward that it had, in fact, been small, a few visits to the house under the pretense of checking on Ha-eun on Se-yeon's behalf. A few conversations with the tutor meant to gather information rather than anything else. Jae-hyun made it very easy to keep telling himself that. "You're Se-yeon's friend," Jae-hyun said the first time they met properly, in the kitchen late, both of them apparently unable to sleep. "She talks about you. Says you're the only person who's ever actually shown up for her." "Trying to? That's rare." Jae-hyun wrapped both hands around a mug of tea he wasn't drinking, looking in the low light, unbearably young and unbearably alone. "Most people just want something from you. It's nice that you don't." Yu-jin, who had in fact come to the kitchen specifically to extract information from him, felt something in his chest twist uncomfortably at that, the particular guilt of a man being complimented for the one thing he wasn't currently doing. "I'm just trying to look out for her," he said, which was true, and which he clung to like a life raft over the following weeks, even as his visits grew more frequent, even as he found himself lingering in doorways Jae-hyun happened to be standing in, even as he started noticing things about Jae-hyun's face and hands, and the exact, devastating gentleness of his voice that had nothing whatsoever to do with looking out for Se-yeon. He told himself every single time that this was reconnaissance, that he was getting close to figure out what was happening, not because he wanted to be close. He believed it right up until the night Jae-hyun cried in front of him. Quietly, apologetically, insisting he was fine, that Yu-jin shouldn't worry about him, that nobody needed to worry about him, ever, he was used to it. And Yu-jin found himself reaching out to wipe a tear from Jae-hyun's cheek before he'd consciously decided to move his hand at all. Jae-hyun let him. Jae-hyun let his hand stay there a beat too long and looked up at him through wet lashes with an expression of such fragile, grateful surprise that Yu-jin's careful reconnaissance mission ended, silently and completely, in that exact moment, though it would take him another 2 weeks to admit it to himself, and considerably longer to admit it to anyone else. He was, of all 3 men, the one who would spend the longest pretending he hadn't fallen at all, which made him, in the end, the one who fell the hardest. He kept a mental ledger of all the reasons it was fine. Se-yeon and Tae-hyun's marriage had been over in every way that mattered for years. He wasn't the one who'd broken anything. He was simply the last honest thing left standing near the wreckage. He updated that ledger nightly, adding entries, never once auditing the total. If he had, he might have noticed that every single line item existed for the sole purpose of explaining why he kept coming back to a kitchen that wasn't his, to a young man who wasn't his either, and had never once claimed to be. There was a version of the truth Jae-hyun kept for himself alone through all of this, unshared even in the small hours when Yu-jin cried in front of him or Do-hyun looked at him like he was something worth fighting for. He had been 18 the first time someone paid his rent in exchange for a smile he didn't mean, and he remembered with total clarity the specific relief of realizing it was easy, that the skill required was not seduction, not really, but attention. Noticing what a person wanted to be told about themselves, and telling them that gently at exactly the moment they needed to hear it. It had nothing to do with beauty, though the beauty helped. It was closer to translation. He simply spoke the language of whatever the room in front of him was starving for, and he had spent the 5 years since making himself, deliberately, entirely unreadable. A still surface that reflected exactly what was looking into it, and revealed nothing underneath. Ha-eun was the first crack in that surface in longer than he could remember, and he resented her for it. A little in the specific way you resent a wound for healing slower than you'd like. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a great many things that autumn, and believed almost none of them, and it had never once mattered, because belief was never the tool he was working with. Chapter 6. 3 idiots. It was Do-hyun who found out first, by accident, catching Jaehyun's phone lighting up with a text from his brother-in-law that was not remotely tutor-appropriate. It was Yu-jin who found out second, walking in on a conversation he wasn't meant to overhear. And it was Tae-hyun who found out last, and worst, discovering in the space of one unbearable evening that the quiet, devoted young man he'd been keeping in a guest room at the edge of his own house had also, somehow, ended up entangled with his wife's brother and his wife's best friend, in a house he thought he alone had access to. The confrontation happened in the garden at night, all three men and Jaehyun standing in an ugly little triangle that should have ended in someone leaving, and instead, humiliatingly, did not. "You've been playing all three of us," Tae-hyun said, low and furious. "I never lied to any of you," Jaehyun said, and his voice shook genuinely or convincingly enough that it made no difference. "I never told any of you I wasn't seeing anyone else. You never asked. I didn't think it was my place to volunteer things you didn't ask for." "That's not the same as honesty," Do-yeon snapped. "No," Jaehyun agreed softly, "but it's not a lie either, is it?" Nobody had an answer for that, because it was, infuriatingly, true, and because all three of them had spent weeks constructing their own private version of Jaehyun, devoted only to me, fragile only for me, without ever once checking whether that version was real. It should have ended there. Three grown men, embarrassed and furious, should have walked away from a 23-year-old tutor and gone back to their separate, dignified lives. Instead, Yu-jin was the one who broke the silence, and what he said surprised even himself. "I don't care. Yu-jin, I don't care that it's not just me. I should. I know I should." He pushed his glasses up, a nervous habit, avoiding Jaehyun's eyes and Tae-hyun's both. I don't want to stop. God help me, I don't want to stop." Do-yeon laughed, short and humorless, and hated himself for the way it came out sounding like relief rather than disgust. "This is insane." "Is it worse than what you're already doing?" Jaehyun asked quietly, looking between the three of them, and something in his face, some calculation, some patience, some genuine strategist's satisfaction at watching three separate plans converge exactly as intended, was there for anyone paying close enough attention to see. Nobody was paying that close attention. That was, as it had always been, the entire point. They didn't call it an arrangement, not out loud, not for a long time, but the visits didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied, Tae-hyun in the evenings, Do-yeon on weekends, Yu-jin whenever Se-yeon didn't need him. Each man privately, uneasily aware of the others and unable, in the end, to make himself walk away first. Because walking away first meant admitting he cared more about pride than about whatever it was Jaehyun made him feel. Chosen, needed, soft, alive in a way none of them could quite name. There were rules, unspoken and constantly renegotiated. Tae-hyun took the evenings because the house was already his to occupy. Do-yeon took the weekends loudly, almost defiantly, as if volume could substitute for legitimacy. Yu-jin took whatever hours were left over, and told himself every single time that this was the last time, and every single time believed it a little less. They were, none of them, proud of the arrangement. But pride, it turned out, was a much smaller thing than any of them had assumed it was. When weighed against the specific, narcotic relief of being the one Jaehyun turned to when he was tired, or frightened, or simply quiet in that particular way that made a man feel like the only stable thing in the room. Each of them, privately, believed himself the exception, the one Jaehyun would have chosen, if circumstances had allowed him to choose only one. None of them ever tested that belief out loud, because some part of each of them understood, without wanting to, exactly what the answer would reveal about all three of them at once. Jaehyun, for his part, went to bed each night in the small guest room at the edge of the house and slept, as he always did, extremely well. He had learned, a long time ago, that guilt was mostly a story people told themselves about wanting to be caught, and he had never once in his entire life wanted that. The arrangement held through the winter, then into spring, in the specific, unglamorous way arrangements survive. Not through grand declarations, but through 100 small accommodations nobody wanted to examine too closely. Tae-hyun stopped asking where Jaehyun had been on the nights he wasn't home. Do-yeon stopped pretending his visits were about Ha-eun. Yu-jin stopped calling Se-yeon as often, and when he did call, found himself steering the conversation away from anything that might require him to lie to her directly, which he told himself was consideration, and which was, in fact, cowardice wearing consideration's clothes. There was a night in February that came close to breaking it. Do-yeon arrived to find Tae-hyun's car already in the driveway, 2 hours earlier than his usual evening return, and something in him, some old, stupid, competitive instinct from a childhood, spent constantly measuring himself against people with more money than his family had, snapped without warning. "You don't get to just decide when you show up," he said, cornering Tae-hyun in the hallway outside the guest room, low enough that Jae-yeon wouldn't hear from inside. "This isn't you don't own him just because you found him first." "I'm not trying to own anyone." Tae-hyun's voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I'm trying to figure out how I ended up here, same as you." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Tae-hyun rubbed a hand over his face. "You think I planned any of this? You think I'm proud of standing in my own hallway negotiating visitation with my wife's little brother?" Do-yeon didn't have anything to say to that, mostly because it was, infuriatingly, exactly what he'd been thinking about himself for weeks and hadn't found the nerve to say out loud. The two men stood there a moment longer, neither willing to be the one who backed down first, until the guest room door opened and Jae-yeon appeared in the doorway in a soft gray sweater too large for him, blinking sleep out of his eyes, looking so small and so genuinely startled by the tension in the hallway that both men's anger simply evaporated, replaced by the specific, competing urge to be the one who comforted him first. "Is everything okay?" Jae-yeon asked, voice thick with sleep, and neither of them noticed that his eyes, for just a moment before they softened, had been entirely clear and entirely awake. By March, the fights had stopped altogether, not because anything had been resolved, but because all three men had quietly, separately, decided that peace with each other was cheaper than the alternative. Jae-yeon let that peace settle over the house like weather and did nothing whatsoever to disturb it. Chapter 7, Bloom he hadn't planned the pregnancy. That part at least was true as anything about Jae-yeon ever was. The dizziness started first, then the exhaustion, then a wave of something that felt uncomfortably like feeling, soft and frightening, and entirely outside his control, curling in his chest every time Ha-eun grabbed his hand, or one of the three men looked at him like he was something worth keeping. Jae-yeon had spent his entire adult life keeping his feelings on a very short leash precisely because he understood, in the marrow of his bones, that a Bloom cycle answered not to biology alone, but to attachment, that the body kept its own accounting of what the heart refused to admit, and cashed it out when it was least convenient. He should have been more careful. He hadn't expected there to be this much to be careful of. He found out alone, in a clinic 2 neighborhoods over from the Kang house, staring at a result he'd been too skilled until now to ever need. He sat in the car outside for 20 minutes afterward, hand pressed flat against his own stomach, feeling something he refused, even privately, to call fear. This changes the math, he told himself, because that was the only language he trusted right now. This changes the math, and math you can work with. He was right, though not in the way he expected. He told Tae-hyun first, because Tae-hyun had the most to lose and therefore the most reason to protect him. He told Do-yeon second, because Do-yeon's pride would never let him be the one left out. He told Yu-jin last, and it was Yu-jin, gentle, glasses-pushing, endlessly earnest Yu-jin, who cried not Jae-yeon, not once, not even privately, and said the words that none of the other two men had thought to say. "Whoever's it is, it doesn't matter. I'm here." Paternity was, and would remain, deliberately, permanently ambiguous, a fact that should have driven the three men apart and instead, bizarrely, welded them together, because none of them could claim him without claiming each other too, and none of them, in the end, wanted to be the one who walked away from a child who might be theirs. Jae-yeon watched that happen with the particular, quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan succeed beyond its own design. He hadn't engineered the pregnancy. He had absolutely, immediately, ruthlessly engineered everything that came after it. "You're keeping it," Tae-hyun said, not quite a question, one hand hovering over Jae-yeon's stomach like he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to touch it yet. "I'm keeping it," Jae-yeon agreed, and let his voice catch just slightly on the word. Because a frightened, vulnerable, pregnant Omega was owed things a merely clever one was not. And Jae-yeon, whatever else he was, had never once left value on the table. The months that followed passed slower than any before them, in the way time does when a body is doing something it has never done before. The first trimester was quiet, almost secretive, Jae-yeon sick in the mornings, hiding it well from Ha-eun and less well from Miss Beek, who began, wordlessly, leaving ginger tea outside his door before he'd even asked. By the second, the household had rearranged itself entirely around him without anyone announcing that it had. Tae-hyun cleared his schedule for doctor's appointments. None of the other two men were told about until after the fact. Do-yeon started showing up with absurd, oversized amounts of fruit, as if volume alone could fix whatever was happening inside a body he didn't understand. Yu-jin read 3 books on Omega pregnancy that he never once mentioned to anyone, and quietly corrected Do-yeon's worst instincts from a careful distance. Ha-eun, for her part, treated the entire event as though it had been engineered specifically for her benefit. She talked to Jayan's stomach nightly, updating it on the day's events with the solemnity of a news anchor, and once, memorably, informed the whole dinner table that the baby had said it wanted to be named after her, a claim nobody had the heart to dispute. By the 3rd trimester, Jayan had stopped performing exhaustion because he no longer needed to. It was simply, uncomplicatedly, real. And there was something almost restful in that, in not having to calculate a single thing about how tired he looked. He let Tae-hyun carry things he could have carried himself. He let Do-yeon drive him to appointments he could have taken a car service to. He let Yu-jin read to him in the evenings, voice low and steady, and did not examine too closely why he'd started actually listening to the words instead of merely enjoying the sound of being read to. He told himself more than once during those months that none of it was changing anything essential about him. He told himself that with less and less conviction each time, and noticed the erosion, and did not know what to do about it, and so, in the way that had always worked for him before, did nothing at all. Chapter 8. What Se-yeon knew. Se-yeon found out the way wives always eventually find out. Not from a confession, but from an accumulation of small wrongnesses that finally added up to a shape she could no longer pretend not to see. It was Ha-eun who broke it open in the end without meaning to. "Ha-eun's having a baby," she announced at dinner, delighted, entirely unaware of the silence that dropped over the table like a blade. "Is it going to be my sister? I want a sister." Se-yeon set down her chopsticks very carefully. "What did you say?" "Jayan's having a baby," Ha-eun repeated, slower, sensing she'd said something wrong but not understanding what. "Daddy said." Se-yeon didn't scream, she didn't throw anything. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she stood, and she walked out of the dining room, and she did not stop walking until she was in her brother's car, 20 minutes later, demanding he tell her everything right now and watching his face, her own brother's face, do something that made the floor of her stomach drop out entirely. "Do-yeon," she said very quietly, "why do you look like that?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She confronted Jayan 2 days later in the garden alone, having sent Ha-eun to a friend's house and Tae-hyun to a meeting she'd fabricated out of pure, controlled fury. Jayan sat on the garden bench with one hand resting, unconsciously or not, over the slight new curve of his stomach, and looked up at her with an expression of such convincing sorrow that Se-yeon nearly lost her nerve before she'd said a single word. "How long?" she said instead, forcing the words out flat. "Does it matter? How long?" "Months," Jayan admitted, softly, letting his eyes fill, letting his voice shake. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Kang. I never meant for it to happen this way. I tried to stop it, I did, I got so attached to all of them, to Ha-eun, and I don't have anyone else, and they were so kind to me, and I know that's not an excuse. Stop." Se-yeon's hands were shaking. "Stop performing for me. I am not one of them. I can see exactly what you're doing." For just a moment, one bare, unguarded second, Jayan's face went still and cold and entirely without apology, and something ancient and clear-eyed looked out at Se-yeon from behind the doe-eyed mask. Something that said, without a single word, "Can you, though? Because it hasn't stopped anything yet." Then it was gone, replaced instantly by trembling, wounded innocence, and Se-yeon was left wondering horribly if she'd imagined it after all. "I would never try to take anything from you," Jayan whispered. "I just wanted to be loved by someone. Is that so hard to understand?" Se-yeon left the garden with nothing. No confession she could use, no crack in the performance she could point to, nothing but the sick, certain knowledge that she was already losing, and had been for months, and hadn't been given the courtesy of knowing it was happening. She went to her mother's grave the next morning, which she hadn't done in over a year, and sat on the cold stone bench beside it for a long time without saying anything at all, because there was nothing left to report that wouldn't have sounded, even to a dead woman, like the plot of a drama too embarrassing to watch to the end. "He's 23, she imagined saying. "He's pregnant, possibly by my husband, possibly by my brother, possibly by the man I've told everything to since I was 19 years old, and I can't prove he did anything wrong because he didn't do anything. He just let it happen to everyone around him, over and over, until there was no one left standing next to me." She drove home with both hands tight on the wheel and did not cry, because crying, she had decided somewhere around hour 3 of that drive, was a luxury reserved for people whose grief still had somewhere useful to go. Chapter 9. The room chooses sides. She tried to expose him anyway, because pride demanded she try something, even a doomed something. She called a family dinner, Tae-hyun, Do-yeon, Yu-jin, Ha-eun, and deliberately Jae-in all in the same room under the same light, so that no one could later claim they hadn't seen clearly. "I want everyone to hear what I have to say," Se-yeon announced, standing at the head of the table she'd once picked out herself, in a house she'd once thought of as hers. "This person has manipulated every single one of you. He's not innocent. He's not fragile. He came into this family and took it apart piece by piece, and none of you noticed because he's very, very good at making you feel like the only one who matters to him." Silence. "Say something," she said to any of them, to all of them. It was Ha-eun who spoke first, small and furious in the way only a child defending someone she loves can be furious. "You're being mean to Ha-eun." "Ha-eun, sweetheart, you don't understand. I don't want you to be mean to him." Ha-eun's voice cracked, tears springing up fast the way they do at 6 years old, total and immediate. "He's nice to me. You're never even home." The words landed exactly where they were aimed, whether or not a 6-year-old understood their own aim, and Se-yeon actually flinched, physically, as if she'd been struck. "She's a child," Se-yeon said, weaker now, looking around the table for backup that did not come. "Tae-hyun, Do-yeon, Yu-jin, someone please." Tae-hyun looked at his plate. Do-yeon looked at Jae-in, and something in his face was so plainly, uselessly protective that it answered the question before he opened his mouth. And Yu-jin, her best friend since she was 19 years old, the one person she had trusted through every collapse in her life, reached over and put a hand gently on Jae-in's shoulder and said very quietly, "Se-yeon, I think you should stop." The betrayal of that gesture, small, careful, unmistakable, did more damage than anything Se-yeon had planned to say all evening. "You're all insane," she whispered. "He hasn't done anything you can point to. That's not innocence. That's technique. Can none of you see that?" Nobody answered her because by then nobody in that room needed to. Jae-in sat with his hand over the small curve of his stomach, eyes wet, saying nothing at all, and let the silence around him do every single thing he'd spent months building it to do. She left the table before dessert alone and stood for a while in the hallway outside, listening through the door to the sound of the dinner resuming without her. Ha-eun's laughter returning first, then Do-yeon's low voice, then, worst of all, Yu-jin's, gentle and apologetic and utterly unwilling to follow her out. She had expected fury. She had expected, if she was honest, at least one of them to come after her. What she got instead was the particular silence of a house that had already, quietly, moved on without waiting for her to catch up. And she understood, standing there in her own front hallway like a stranger, that this was what losing actually felt like. Not a single dramatic blow, but 100 small, ordinary sounds of a life continuing without you in the next room. Chapter 10, Soft Life. Se-yeon left the house within the month. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no thrown vase, nothing that would have made a satisfying story for anyone still willing to listen to her side of it, which by then was almost no one. She simply packed, quietly, into a much smaller apartment across the city, and began the long, humiliating work of explaining to friends and colleagues why her marriage, her family, her entire constructed life had come apart so completely, so fast, while everyone around her seemed to already understand and had simply decided, collectively, that it wasn't worth defending. Ha-eun visited her on weekends. She always asked within the first 10 minutes when she could go home to Ha-eun. The bond was formalized 8 months later, quiet and legal and entirely without scandal by the time it happened, because scandal requires an audience willing to be shocked, and everyone who mattered had long since stopped being shocked by anything involving Jae-in. 3 tethers, 1 household, 1 soft, sleepy newborn with dark eyes that could have belonged to any of the 3 men, and by unspoken agreement, was allowed to belong to all of them at once. Those 8 months had not been simple, whatever the calm of the ceremony suggested afterward. There had been a custody negotiation over Ha-eun that dragged through the summer, Se-yeon fighting for weekday visits she'd rarely used when she'd had them by default, and losing most of that fight not because a judge favored Jae-in, but because Ha-eun herself, interviewed alone in a quiet office by a court-appointed counselor, had said, without hesitation, that she wanted to live where Ha-eun lived. There had been a stretch in early summer when Do-yeon stopped speaking to his sister entirely, and another, harder stretch in July when Yu-jin finally told Se-yeon the truth in full, sitting across from her in a coffee shop neither of them finished their coffee at, and watched 20 years of friendship end in under 10 minutes. Quietly, the way most important things in that year seemed to end. Tae-hyun's board had asked polite, pointed questions about his personal life that he'd answered with the same practiced calm he used in earnings calls. and the company's stock had dipped for exactly one news cycle before the world, as it always does, found something else to be scandalized by. None of it had touched Jae-hyun directly. It never did. He had simply waited, patient as weather, for all of it to finish happening around him, and then walked calmly into whatever the dust had settled into. Jae-hyun wore pale cream that day because it suited him, and stood between three alphas who each looked at him like he was the only good thing that had ever happened to them. And Ha-eun stood at his side in a small matching dress, holding his hand, glowing. He smiled through the whole ceremony. It was, by every visible measure, a real smile. Afterward, much later, after the house had gone quiet and the baby had finally settled, and all three men had fallen asleep in various rooms with the particular boneless exhaustion of people who had gotten, at last, everything they wanted, Jae-hyun sat alone by the nursery window with his daughters. The one true, unplanned thing in his entire architecture of a life. Small hand curled around one of his fingers. He thought about Se-yeon briefly, the way you think about weather in a city you no longer live in. He thought about Tae-hyun's face at the ceremony, and Do-hyun's and Yu-jin's, each of them so certain, so relieved, so thoroughly convinced that what they'd built together was mutual. He looked down at Ha-eun's little hand around his finger, and felt, unmistakably, the one real thing he'd never planned for and had long since stopped trying to talk himself out of. And then, very quietly, to no one, not to the sleeping house, not to the men who loved him, not even really to himself, he said the thing he had never once said out loud, and never would, not to a single living soul in that house, for as long as he lived in it. I never meant a word of it, not one. The baby sighed in her sleep. Outside, the city went on, indifferent, the way it always had. Jae-hyun sat by the window a while longer, warm and safe and exactly, finally, as comfortable as he had always intended to be, and did not feel guilty about any of it, not even a little, not even once. The end.